Hey everyone, tonight we're about to delve into something a little darker, a world of plagues, punishments, and unthinkable survival. We're going to uncover the brutal truth of life during the Middle Ages. Forget the fairy tales you've been sold by Hollywood, knights, chivalry, and castles. The real medieval world was far more grim, and honestly, you'd be lucky to survive a single day in it. Before we take this journey back in time, go ahead and hit like on the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. I always love hearing from you, so drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's amazing to see how far and wide this community stretches, so don't be shy. Now, dim the lights and maybe turn on a fan to create that eerie background hum. Prepare yourself because we're stepping into a time like no other. Picture this. You wake up in the year 1325. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the fleas. Your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress stuffed with bugs, hay, and the faint scent of a barn floor because, well, that's exactly what it used to be just a few months ago. No memory foam, no fluffy pillows, and certainly no Egyptian cotton sheets. You're wrapped in a wool blanket that hasn't seen soap since last winter, and it weighs as much as a small cow from the layers of grime. You open your eyes. The first thing you hear, the distant clang of the church bell, the medieval version of an alarm clock, louder, more unforgiving, and somehow even more relentless. The day has begun, and it's not giving you any mercy. Your home is a wooden hut with just one room, no windows, no ventilation, just an open concept nightmare where your family, livestock, and bugs all coexist in the same space. And the smell? It's like a symphony of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something that might just be mold. You pray it's not, but deep down, you know it probably is. No scented candles to make the air bearable. Not that they do much on the dirt floor anyway. You stretch out, but regret it almost immediately. The air is frigid, and every joint in your body protests. You're only 22, which, in medieval terms, makes you roughly middle-aged. Your spine cracks like an old door, and your knees, well, they sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor could be soaked from last night's rain, leaking through the thatched roof, or it could be crusty from something your neighbor's chicken left behind. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ever-present ecosystem. And privacy? Don't even think about it. Your entire family is awake, and maybe a cousin who's overstayed their welcome. There's no bedroom, no curtains, no me time, just communal living. Welcome to your morning in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone, not because of your family, but because the rats, the bugs, and the lingering stench are always there. And this is just how your day begins. Now that you've managed to drag yourself out of your medieval haystack of misery, nature calls. And it's not calling politely, it's screaming at you. The modern bathroom, it's a distant dream, and you'll quickly start to miss it. There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, nothing. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a public spectacle. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is likely a wooden bucket behind the house, and it's already full because Uncle Wolfstan had a rough night after eating some bad turnips. The smell? It's biblical. You hold your breath, do your business, and then, here's the kicker, toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout Gardilou, meaning watch out below, before tossing your waste out the window. But honestly, no one moves fast enough. The streets are open sewers, a lovely river of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery liquids you'd rather not know the origin of. If you're lucky enough to live in a town with public latrines, congratulations. You get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in a cramped outhouse where privacy is a joke and ventilation is an even worse one. No toilet paper here. You wipe with straw, leaves, rags, or if you're lucky, a scrap of wool. Sometimes you don't wipe at all. If you're in a castle, surely it's better, right? Well, kind of. You might have a guard robe, a hole in the wall that dumps your waste into the moat. Sounds like a great idea until you realize that attackers knew about it. And yes, they sometimes climbed up through the waste hole, entering through the back door. Talk about a real life dumping ground. Whether you're a farmer or a baron, medieval toileting is a humiliating, cold, and dangerous experience. One slip on a whetstone path, and you could end up face first in humanity's leftovers, and that's just the beginning. You've survived the toilet ordeal. Congratulations. But now it's time to eat. You've earned a nice breakfast, right? Something warm, comforting, and delicious. Well, sorry to disappoint you, but this is medieval Europe. There's nothing comforting here. Breakfast, if you can even call it that, is a grim affair. No eggs, Benedict, no coffee machines, no avocado, toast. You sit or squat near the fire with a wooden bowl of something that looks suspiciously like it was scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily ration of pottage. It's a thick, gloopy stew made of whatever you can scrape together. Grains, root vegetables, maybe a few beans if you're lucky, and it's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks. New ingredients are just dumped on top of the old ones. It's less of a recipe and more of an ongoing edible experiment. On the side, a hunk of bread so hard it could deflect arrows. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, often bulked up with sawdust, ground acorns, or whatever cheap filler they could find, because wheat, that's for the rich. And the drink, it's not orange juice or oat milk lattes. No, you're drinking beer at 6 more a.m. Why? Because the water is teeming with parasites and filth. So you start your day with weak ale. It's low in alcohol, but high in survivability. Kids drink it too. No one likes it, but at least it won't kill you immediately. Want some meat or cheese? Dream on. That's for Sundays and saints' feast days, and only if your Lord is feeling generous. Most peasants only get meat a few times a year. Fresh fruit only when it's in season, and if it's not already fermented into wine. Don't even think about spices unless you're royalty. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. Breakfast doesn't energize you, it just happens to you. And now that you're properly underfed, it's time to work. But work isn't optional. Your life depends on it. You've eaten your sad medieval breakfast. Now it's time to get dressed. Not that it will help much. Your wardrobe consists of one outfit, just one. It's a rough wool tunic or linen shift that you've worn every day for months, possibly years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. It's wear this until it disintegrates or until you get a fungal infection. Underwear? Optional. If you're lucky, maybe a linen undertunic. If not, well, you're going commando under layers of itchy wool sewn together by someone who didn't quite understand how seams worked. No washing machine, no soap, no dry cleaner. Your clothes are stained, stiff, and smell like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty. And the shoes, if you have any, they're made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, and offer as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants, they go barefoot through mud, through dung, through medieval landmines, aka sharp rocks, and disease puddles. Your skin hates you. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs live rent-free on your body. Everyone has them. Nobles, monks, children, everyone. Itchy, uncomfortable, and relentless. If you're lucky enough to escape infection, that rash will stick with you for months. Your skin is raw from constant rubbing. Your scalp? A battlefield of bites. And if you develop a rash, well, too bad. no dermatologists, no relief. You just keep on suffering. Now that you're dressed in misery, wrapped in discomfort, it's time to go outside and work yourself to the bone. Work that will break your back and leave you with nothing but aches and exhaustion. And if you're wondering where the escape is, there isn't one. Work starts with the sun and ends only when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools are simple: a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and your body. There's no weekend, no clocking out, no respite. You work until your spine resembles the letter S, and you pray for the day to end. No one cares if you're tired. No one cares about your mental health. If you're a woman, surprise, you don't just work the land. You care for children, cook, clean, spin wool, and feed animals, while trying to ignore the lice slowly migrating to your side of the bed. If you're lucky enough not to be a farmer, you might work as a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper. But whatever your job is, you're still a peasant, and that means your life is one long, exhausting struggle just to survive another day. You still spend your days working with fire, chemicals, or animal guts, all in poorly ventilated sheds. The pay? It's barely enough to survive. The perks? Well, if you're lucky, maybe just the occasional bleeding. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a fever? Drink some warm beer. Push through and keep going. You can't afford to stop. Not even for a single day. Because in medieval Europe, if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that too. It's called being replaced. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters forming on your hands, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career. It's an endurance test, a slow march towards an inevitable fate. Now, as your back aches from the grueling labor in the fields, let's talk about the weather, shall we? Because in the Middle Ages, temperature isn't about the changing seasons. It's about an ongoing punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, no way to block the chill. Just wooden walls with gaps so wide you could throw a chicken through them. Your windows? Covered with cloth, not glass. The fire in the hearth? A nice thought, but there's never enough firewood to keep it going because wood is expensive. And don't even think about gathering it from the forest. It's sometimes illegal. Yes, you could be executed for picking up the wrong stick in the wrong forest. So you bundle up in your one damp wool tunic, huddle near the dying embers, and still wake up with your nose frozen, your feet permanently cold, often damp. Your fingers feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite doesn't get diagnosed here. It's simply called bad luck. Now, fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In the summer, your home turns into a clay oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and certainly no deodorant. You sweat through your clothes, but you can't remove them because showing too much skin is scandalous, and it also invites sunburn, insect bites, and judgment from your fellow villagers. Flies swarm your body, drawn to the unwashed stench of your sweat and last week's goat stew fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear, mocking you while you try to sleep, assuming you can even get any rest amidst the constant noise of neighbors yelling and babies crying. The sun beats down on you in the fields. No sunblock, no hat to shield your face, unless you've managed to fashion one out of straw like some desperate scarecrow. And worst of all, you still have to work. Heat stroke? That's just called taking a bad turn. So you're either shivering, wondering if your toes will survive until spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe mercilessly. And one thing remains constant. No matter the season, your clothes still itch, your food still tastes like misery, and your next task is always waiting to break you. Welcome to medieval climate control, or more accurately, the lack of it. Thirsty? Want to splash a little water on your face to shake off this damp fever dream of a life? Too bad. In the Middle Ages, water isn't your friend. It's trying to quietly murder you. Let's talk about drinking. The nearby stream looks fresh, bubbling, clear, a picturesque sight straight out of a fairy tale. But here's the spoiler. It's not. Upstream, someone just dumped their chamber pot into it. Or maybe a dead pig is decomposing in the water. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe is waiting in every sip you take. That's why people drank beer. Yes, beer. Even the children. But don't get the wrong idea. It wasn't like modern beer. It was weak in alcohol, but strong in survival. Brewing it boiled the water, making it safer than whatever was flowing through the town's open sewers. Wine, that's only for the rich, and it won't make you feel human until afternoon. Bathing? Oh, sure. In theory, water was supposed to clean you, but in practice, it was considered a risk to your health. People believed bathing opened your pores, letting in disease. So, ironically, they thought you were cleaner if you never washed off the layer of filth caked onto your skin. Sure, there were communal bathhouses, but they had reputations for gossip, scandal, and sometimes other unsavory activities. Naturally, the church got involved and shut many of them down. Even if you did want to bathe, it was a massive production. You'd have to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a leaky wooden tub, and pray that no one else in the house used it before, or worse, after you did. Rainwater collected in open barrels where birds poop, insects breed, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? Whether the water's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops, medieval water is less about life and more about gambling with death. One wrong gulp, and you're spending your last days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach, and contemplating your choices. So, next time you sip your clean tap water, remember the Middle Ages. They didn't have the luxury of hydration without hazard. Sick? Need a doctor? Too bad. You live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is little more than polite torture with a theology degree. Let's talk about diagnosis. Everything wrong with you, whether it's a cough, rash, broken bone, or the creeping plague, is the result of your humors being out of balance. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were believed to control your health. If they're out of whack, you're in trouble. Got a fever? Too much blood. The solution? Bloodletting. That's right. Drain your life force with a dull blade or a hungry leech. And guess who's often doing it? Barbers. Imagine getting a haircut and a bloodletting in one sitting. 2 for 1. Feeling sad or anxious? Well, that's an excess of black bile. The cure: laxatives, herbal purges, or just prayers and cold compresses, while everyone avoids eye contact with you and starts carving your coffin. Got a broken bone or a nasty wound? You're in serious trouble. No anesthesia, unless you count passing out from the pain. Surgery is done with knives that haven't been cleaned in ages, and tools are heated over fire not to sterilize them, but because it makes them look scarier. Antibiotics? Centuries away. Germ theory? Not invented. Diseases come from bad air or God's wrath for your sins. Got a stomach ache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Hope you enjoy confessing while vomiting. If your condition worsens, you'll be treated with more leeches, maybe some crushed beetles, and a priest at your bedside giving last rites just in case. If by some miracle you recover, the doctor takes full credit and the leech gets promoted. After a long day of labor, lice, and leeches, it's finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your hovel, stomach growling, ready for the one joy left in your life, a warm meal. But don't get too excited. Your meal is probably trying to kill you. Food preservation didn't exist. There were no fridges, no freezers, just salt, smoke, or the hope that the cold winter air would keep things fresh. Your meat, if you're lucky enough to have any, it's been hanging for days, covered in flies, and marinated in questionable brine. Bread? It's the cornerstone of the medieval diet. But even that isn't safe. During bad harvest years, desperate peasants bulk it up with bark, sawdust, or even clay to make it stretch. Oh, and if it's rye season, there's a bonus. Ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables, only if they're in season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips. So many turnips. Boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage. Remember that lovely swamp of mystery ingredients from earlier. Fruit? If it's available, it rots quickly. Sugar? Rare, expensive, and hoarded by the rich. And dairy? It's another gamble. Milk spoils in hours, but butter and cheese survive longer if you consider bacteria to be an acceptable form of preservation. And seasoning? Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg were worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, salt, if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard, it's a political one too. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. Catch a rabbit? You could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. So, as you sit down to your gray stew by flickering firelight, remember, every bite is a risk. But you eat it anyway, because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish you, it tests you. That label you're given in the Middle Ages often comes with a complimentary drowning or burning, depending on local fashion. Childbirth? It's nothing short of a deadly lottery. There's no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Midwives do their best, but even the smallest complication can mean death for the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many don't survive even one. But don't worry. Once the baby is out, your work increases. Now, you have a screaming infant in a lice-ridden hut, and you're expected to nurse, cook, clean, and still help in the fields. No rest, no breaks. You are the break. Your life exists to serve everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, you're vulnerable. If you're outspoken, well, you're dangerous. Women who didn't conform to the rules were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they had herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or even just looked at someone the wrong way on a rainy Tuesday. Even in the church, your role was limited. Nuns lived under strict, suffocating rules. No speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and spiritually, always ranked below men. In short, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, you were expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally while smiling, because even in an age of universal suffering, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. So far, you've fought off filth, starvation, social injustice, and possibly even a goat. But just when you think your day can't get any worse, here comes violence, loud, bloody, and, by medieval standards, completely acceptable. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were far from peaceful. Law and order, that mostly meant hoping the local lord wasn't in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere, in the home, in the streets, on the battlefield, even in church disputes, and sometimes in line at the communal bread oven. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice, it's more of a performance art than actual protection. Steal a loaf of bread, you could lose a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue might be pierced. Gossip too much? Meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped to your head with a bar in your mouth. A correction device, of course. Now, if you're accused of something truly serious, heresy, theft, witchcraft, how do you prove your innocence? Simple. By being tortured. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One version. You stick your hand in boiling water to retrieve a stone. If your hand heals without infection in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another option. They toss you into a river. If you sink, you're innocent, but probably dead. If you float, you're guilty and punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival and the host is actively rooting against you. And if you're sentenced to death, that's a public event. Executions are performed in front of cheering crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes people bring snacks. It's the medieval equivalent of cable TV. Domestic violence? Completely normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline their wives and children. Street fights? Commonplace. You could be beaten just for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse, and war? Always simmering. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone's always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or sheer boredom. Violence isn't just a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. It is society. Everyone lives with the constant knowledge that life is fragile, justice is arbitrary, and your neighbor might bash your head in over a pig. So, walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone carrying a club. At this point, you've made it through the lice, the leeches, the laundryless misery, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, an early and unglamorous death. If you're alive and still breathing past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity. You might even be called the Old One, which isn't a nickname. It's more of a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. The average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but that number is heavily dragged down by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children die before reaching age 5. Disease, malnutrition, or one bad winter, that's all it takes. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survive childhood, you enter adulthood already exhausted. Work begins as soon as you can walk upright, and by 25, your joints creak like an old monastery door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women, however, faced an even deadlier gauntlet: childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical intervention, just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. For men, the dangers were different, but no less relentless. Farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, or a crusade gone sideways. Even walking to the market could be risky if you crossed paths with a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could also come quietly from the plague that turned cities into cemeteries overnight, or from famine that could last entire seasons, thinning out whole villages, or bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your last hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. Funerals. You were lucky if you got one. Bodies were often buried quickly to avoid disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow mound of earth if there was enough space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its casual forms. You didn't retire, you just stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's talk about your final chapter, the medieval dream. How's your day been so far? You've woken up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, nearly passed out from hunger, worked until your spine cried for mercy, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed to avoid the plague, and barely dodged a public execution for owning a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Think again. That romanticized version of the Middle Ages, gallant swordsmen, noble ladies in towers, heroic battles, and feasts in candlelit halls. is a myth polished by fairy tales and fantasy books. In truth, the medieval world was gritty, cruel, and deeply unfair. Hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born rich, congratulations, you had a better chance of surviving. But you were still one bad soup away from dysentery and a hasty burial. Even the nobles weren't immune to misery. Castles were drafty stone refrigerators, filled with fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Sure, you had a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a skirmish or from an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. The simpler times weren't simple. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. Everything, from childbirth to chewing, came with consequences. Life was survival, not leisure. And if you did find a quiet moment to think, to dream, to imagine something better, there wasn't much you could do with it. No upward mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to Google, "What's this weird rash?" You lived, suffered, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the wildest part. Through all of this, people still laughed, sang songs, told stories, fell in love, and found meaning. Not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, they made space for light. So tonight, when you slip into your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, maybe say a quiet thank you to the modern world and to your ancestors who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to. However, Catherine had her own game in mind to become acceptable in Russian society. She converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Catherine Alexeyevna. The ceremony wasn't just a religious conversion, it was a monumental act, a symbolic burning of the bridge behind her. She was stepping into a foreign empire with no way back. Nobody watching that quiet teenage girl in her fur-trimmed coat could have predicted what would come next. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. But from the moment Sophie set foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began quietly planning how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was supposed to solidify her place in Russian royalty, but from the very beginning, it felt less like a crown and more like a cage. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was not the dashing prince of fairy tales. He was awkward, immature, and obsessed with toy soldiers. His mind was more consumed by playing war games in his chambers than governing an empire or showing affection to his new wife. Some accounts even suggest that he refused to consummate the marriage for years. Peter idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russians' court that had adopted him. In contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She didn't just want to belong, she wanted to rule. Peter, however, wanted to escape. This mismatch wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was declining, and everyone knew a transition was coming. Each person had an agenda, and Catherine was being watched constantly. Her letters were read, her friendships monitored, and her every move scrutinized. Catherine couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who was still whispering in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her servants. In this world, alliances could turn into accusations overnight. But Catherine was no fool. She learned how to play the court's games, cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, befriended scholars, and developed a reputation for dignity and restraint, a sharp contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and open disdain for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Catherine began reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu, while others saw her merely as a young consort. She was building a vision, not just for herself, but for Russia, a nation of strength, education, and reason. But there was a problem. The longer Peter lived, the longer Catherine remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, and planned. She knew the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited. It would have to be seized. In 1762, after nearly 2 decades of watching and maneuvering, Catherine saw her moment and seized it with breathtaking precision. Empress Elizabeth had passed away, and Peter III was now Tsar. His reign, however, began to unravel almost immediately. In just a few months, Peter had alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and lavished praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed key policies, humiliated the clergy, and openly spoke about divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Catherine, began to grumble in the corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, saw Peter as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Catherine, watching all of this unfold, made her move. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at his summer palace, Catherine launched a bloodless coup supported by key military officers, including her lover, Gregory Orlov, and his influential brothers. Catherine rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and won the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catherine was now empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by will, wit, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle. But her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without suffering the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule, not as a schemer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested on her power, but she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russia, and not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter had worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people. Even if she herself ruled with absolute authority, Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy, she lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Diderot to her court and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's nakaz, or instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise. It spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical, but Enlightenment ideals had to survive the harsh realities of Russia, an empire that was vast, feudal, and deeply conservative. Catherine knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act, a philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make it Russian. She was trying to make Russia modern on her terms. And that meant reform, yes, but with an iron hand in a velvet glove. Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward, to forge an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls entirely. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched further than ever before. She waged wars, not merely to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about territory. They were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under the guidance of generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin, Russia captured key regions, including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian czars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin of Europe. It was a continental force to be reckoned with. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth alongside Austria and Prussia. By the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was erased from the map, and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies. She also colonized with ideas. New cities were built, trade routes expanded, and German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a vast mosaic, stretching from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. And through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the expansion of her empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, Expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia, she wanted to remake it into a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great became just as famous for what transpired behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated parade of them, many decades younger, often handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Gregory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin wasn't just a lover, he was her co-ruler in many ways. Still, Europe couldn't look past the scandal. Gossip swirled, satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, the rumors only grew worse, the most infamous of these being the grotesque, completely false tale involving a horse, spread by her enemies in an effort to smear her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded power unapologetically. In a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, and that made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics painted her as immoral, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed that pleasure was a natural part of life and that personal relationships didn't have to threaten public responsibility. She separated emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers ever achieved. In reality, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically useful. And when they ceased to be, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her rule. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. For all her charisma and control, Catherine's reign was not without peril. In 1773, that peril came in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel. Pugachev claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. According to him, he had survived the coup and now returned to reclaim the throne from the German usurper. It was absurd. Peter was long gone, but to Russia's oppressed and exhausted lower classes, the claim didn't need to be true. It just needed to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and land for the common people. His words lit a fire across the Volga River region, especially among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers. In a time when the gap between nobles and serfs had widened brutally, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev Rebellion became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were taken, fortresses fell, nobles were slaughtered. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if the empire itself might fracture. Catherine was shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within her own people, rising against the very system she ruled. But Catherine didn't panic. She acted. She dispatched professional military forces to crush the rebellion ruthlessly. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and eventually beheaded in Moscow, a public warning to all who dared to follow. Afterward, Catherine doubled down on order and control. Her dreams of liberating the serfs quietly faded into silence. The rebellion had shown her the limits of Enlightenment ideals in a country still shackled by feudalism. She now leaned harder on the nobility who offered loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This was a turning point. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reform became cautious, surveillance increased, rebellion, even whispered, was to be stomped out before it had breath. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a warning that haunted Catherine. Power built on inequality could only hold so long before the storm came crashing through. The time Catherine the Great approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades, longer than any female ruler in Russian history. From the moment she seized power, she defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under Catherine's reign, Russia became a true European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military victories. They were strategic pivots, securing warm water ports and reshaping trade. But her legacy wasn't only drawn on maps. Catherine left a cultural mark as well. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe, and corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often viewed as backward by Western Europeans, Catherine put Russia firmly on the cultural map. She modernized education, founding schools for girls and promoting the printing of books. She introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself. A groundbreaking act of scientific bravery. Yet her reign was also filled with contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom deeper into Russia's territories. Her reforms, though impressive, remained mostly top-down, designed to polish the empire without truly transforming its foundations. Still, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not inherited. It was crafted, managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress, but above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a throne secure, an empire expanded, and a legend that would endure for centuries. Catherine didn't just reign, she ruled with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her power, expansion, and enduring legacy, Catherine the Great was, at her core, a woman navigating a man's world and reshaping it in her image. Behind the imperial portraits and state decrees was someone deeply aware of how precarious her position was. She was not born Russian. She came to the throne through a coup. She ruled an empire that didn't want a woman in charge. And yet, she not only endured, she thrived. Catherine was never content to be ornamental. She read constantly, wrote endlessly, and never stopped learning. Her daily schedule was intense. Hours of reading reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state papers, and managing a court filled with rival factions. She wasn't content to simply sit on the throne. She worked the throne like a stateswoman born to it. She was also, in many ways, lonely. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, yet wrote in her memoirs about how few people she could truly trust. Her son Paul, whom she distrusted and kept away from state matters, grew into a man she feared would undo all her progress. Her greatest emotional partnership with Gregory Potemkin faded into deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never truly healed. Catherine crafted her image carefully. She understood the power of narrative and wielded it better than most monarchs of her age. She posed as the mother of Russia, the enlightened monarch, the warrior empress, and the lover of the arts. But beneath those roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion, and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire transformed, but also questions. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by politics? Was she more reformer or ruler? History remembers her by the title she never gave herself, the Great. It wasn't because she was flawless, kind, or just. It was because she took power and wielded it on her own terms, in a time and place where women weren't supposed to have any. She didn't just wear the crown, she rewrote what it meant to deserve one. The interior was coated in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide used ceremonially by the Maya, and within that crimson haze lay the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care, reverence, and attention to detail. Her bones, fragile yet intact, her skull still adorned with a jade mask, and her body encircled by burial offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all crafted from jade and shell. Every aspect of this burial screamed royalty, yet no name was inscribed. No glyphs identified her. This was one of the richest female burials ever discovered in Mesoamerica, and yet it remained a complete enigma. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was she? Was she a queen, a priestess, or perhaps even the wife of Pal, the king? Researchers named her the Red Queen, and the name stuck. But even with modern forensic tools, no one could say for sure who she was, only that she had lived around the 7th century during the golden age of Palenque. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been hidden, untouched, and purposefully isolated. Her burial wasn't just ceremonial, it was spiritual. This woman wasn't meant to be remembered with words. She was meant to be remembered through ritual, through color, and through the mystery she left behind. The most haunting feature of the Red Queen's tomb wasn't her jade jewelry or the eerie silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick layer of powdered cinnabar covered everything: the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, even the offerings around her. It clung to the stone like blood. To the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was one of the most sacred and dangerous substances in the ancient world. Its vibrant red color wasn't just visually striking, it symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force that connected the human and divine realms. Red was sacred. It was the color of sunrise, of sacrifice, of life emerging from death. And it wasn't just symbolic, it was spiritual. Covering the dead in cinnabar was a ritual meant to transform the body, not for eternity, but for transition. In Maya belief, death wasn't the end, it was a passage, a crossing into another cosmic layer. So, the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared, not just for burial, but for deification. But there's another layer to this. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can lead to mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, and even death. The Maya may not have fully understood the chemistry, but they felt its potency. It was volatile, powerful, dangerous. To bathe the corpse in cinnabar was to declare this person was no ordinary mortal. In Palenque, very few were buried with cinnabar. Pal the Great, the mighty king whose pyramid dominates the site, was one. His body, like hers, was also saturated in the red powder. That detail alone has fueled speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal divine status? Her skull had been placed on a layer of jaguar skin, another sacred symbol. Around her body, bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines hinted at rituals performed either during her life or in her honor after death. Every part of her burial told a story without words, a story of power cloaked in secrecy, a woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony, drenched in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-drenched remains was a world of silence, broken only by the gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian. These weren't just ornaments, they were offerings, each one carefully chosen to accompany her on the journey to the Maya afterlife. Xibalba. At her sides were jade necklaces, heavy and cold, their polished surfaces still radiant after 300 years. Underground, jade was not just beautiful, it was sacred. The Maya considered it a symbol of eternal life. It represented the green of maize, the vitality of the jungle, and the breath of the gods. Only the elite were buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign that, in life, she wielded influence, perhaps even divine favor. One of the most haunting objects found in her tomb was the jade burial mask placed delicately over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of Egypt, this one was subtle, constructed from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles, arranged to mimic the contours of her skull. The mask served a ritual function to protect the soul, preserve identity, and present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. These could have been tools of ritual or symbols of her status as a priestess, healer, or royal matriarch. One bone pin was engraved, faint but purposeful, a small echo of her voice lost to time. At her feet and along the edges of the tomb were ceramic vessels, still sealed, likely once filled with offerings, food, drink, or incense to sustain her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a journey, dangerous, layered, filled with challenges. These items weren't luxuries. They were necessities. To modernize, the tomb feels intimate, not overloaded, but intentional. There was no gold, no chariots, no pomp, just items chosen with spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we glimpse how the Maya understood death, not as finality, but as a transition of power. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. For all the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting void. No name, no inscriptions adorned her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was clearly someone powerful, but who? From the moment her tomb was opened, scholars began trying to connect the dots. The most compelling theory is that the Red Queen was Zakbu Aha, the wife of Kinich Janab Pakal, known today as Pal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palanque. Zakbu Aha was more than just Pal's consort. She was born into nobility, married into Palanca's royal dynasty at a young age, bore at least 3 sons, all of whom held high status and played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. Supporting this theory was the tomb's location, just a few feet away from Pal's own grand burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. The proximity suggests a deliberate pairing. Husband and wife rulers, even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palanque were found with such intense cinnabar coverage. Pal and the Red Queen. It's unlikely this was coincidence. But here's where the mystery deepens. DNA tests were conducted on both sets of remains in hopes of confirming the connection, but the results were inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Pal, but that didn't rule out a spousal relationship. After all, marriage doesn't require shared blood. Some have argued that she could have been Sakuk, Pal's powerful mother who ruled Palenque before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost to history's erosion. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Zakbu Aha, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pal. The lack of a name may not have been an oversight. It may have been intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on, not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the whispers of the earth. And so, the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and truth. A woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from, a world where Maya women, especially royal ones, held more influence than many realize. In Maya civilization, politics was often a family affair. Royal women weren't merely passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and power brokers. They conducted rituals, sponsored temples, and played crucial roles in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Take Sakuk, for example, the mother of Pal the Great. When the throne of Palenque was left vacant, she took power herself and ruled as queen regent until her son came of age. She wasn't a placeholder. She was a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees, overseeing construction projects. Without her, Pal may never have risen at all, and she wasn't an anomaly. Across the Maya world, in places like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, inscriptions show women performing major ceremonies, engaging in warfare, diplomacy, and sometimes ruling outright. They were often portrayed in stelae and murals, dressed in elaborate headdresses and regalia, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered until they weren't. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that memory had eroded. The colonial lens saw native women as silent figures in a male-dominated world. But archaeology tells a different story, a story of complex gender roles, where power was negotiated, not simply inherited. This context casts the Red Queen in a new light. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and positioned beside Pal, suggests she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask wasn't just decoration, it was a symbol of identity, of power held in life and protected in death. Her bloodline may have been the very glue that held Palenque's dynasty together. In Maya civilization, a queen wasn't just a queen. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in ceremony, and often the bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her world, she was never voiceless. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with treasures, she was buried in architecture, rich with purpose, layered with Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design. Her tomb wasn't merely a grave, it was a gateway to eternity. Her body was discovered inside Temple 3, one of the smaller pyramids within the heart of Palenque. Yet its proximity to the Temple of the Inscriptions, the resting place of Pal the Great, is significant. These temples weren't built randomly. Their positioning was sacred, guided by astrology, myth, and dynastic legacy. Temple 3 rises modestly compared to its grand neighbor, but it hides something even more intimate, a sealed crypt, untouched by looters, perfectly preserved, constructed deep within the temple's core. The tomb was accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into her tomb feels almost symbolic, a ritual journey downward into the underworld. The chamber itself is stark, made of cut stone, sealed tightly for over 130 years. No glyphs or murals cover the walls. No ornate carvings tell her story. But perhaps that silence is intentional. This was a space not for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. At the center, her sarcophagus sits like an altar, crafted from limestone. It echoes the grand stone coffin of Pal, just next door. While Pal's lid is famously engraved with scenes of cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is more subdued. The focus is inward, on the body, on the cinnabar, on the ritual of death itself. Yet there are subtle architectural cues that hint at meaning. The tomb is aligned east to west, symbolizing the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small but powerful. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone revered. Maya temples were cosmological tools, bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried in one was to be elevated beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought. It was a carefully constructed shrine, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy in the architecture itself. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing wasn't only spiritual, it was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Burial rituals were carefully choreographed events rooted in myth and meant to guide the soul through the treacherous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and iconography tell us that Xibalba was no peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could make the journey successfully. The Red Queen was buried, wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all signs of an elite burial. But there's more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hints at auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic tools representing rites she had performed in life, or that were reenacted at her burial to empower her spirit. Her jade burial mask, carefully assembled from mosaic tiles, wasn't simply decorative. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity as she journeyed into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may have once held chocolate, maize, water, or even pulque to nourish her in the next world. Other items, like stingray spines or shell trumpets, could have represented spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication. Burial wasn't just a goodbye, it was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly incarnations of gods, and in death they returned to those divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, entombed in a pyramid, and honored with offerings, was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a being tied to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her legend. Just a few steps away from the Red Queen's final resting place lies one of the most iconic tombs in Mesoamerica, that of Kinich Janab Pakal, known simply as Paul the Great. His burial inside the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions is celebrated for its artistry, scale, and deeply spiritual symbolism. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb so extraordinary is not only what was inside, it's where it was found. Her sarcophagus was hidden within Temple 3, directly adjacent to Pal's monument. In a city like Palenque, where every temple was carefully positioned to reflect cosmic principles, this closeness was no coincidence. It was intentional, a statement etched in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Zakbu Aha, Pal's queen and trusted consort. While her tomb lacks inscriptions, The similarities between their burials are striking. Both wrapped in cinnabar, both entombed in pyramids, both buried with jade, and both treated with extreme reverence. These rituals mirror each other as if two halves of a sacred narrative. Pal's lid famously depicts him falling into the underworld tree, a cosmic scene of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler tomb contains no such iconography, but the symbolism lies in the pairing itself. If Pal represented the sun, journeying through the underworld at night to rise again, then the Red Queen may have represented the moon, the feminine force that follows its own mysterious path in the sky. Together, they embodied a cosmic duality, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Maya mythology, rulership was not singular, it was relational. Harmony in the cosmos required balance, and that balance extended into the dynastic court. By placing the Red Queen beside Paul, the Maya were preserving not just a marriage, but a cosmic partnership. Their proximity in death may have mirrored their roles in life. A queen, not behind, but beside her king, sharing not just a throne, but a legacy. In their tombs, they speak without words. Two souls, wrapped in cinnabar and stone, joined across eternity. One of history's most sacred silences. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures, not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most enigmatic and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, inviting questions that echo louder with every discovery. She represents a mystery that still resists full understanding. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph carved her name. No stele told her story. And yet, the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, and the symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones all speak of a woman profoundly important, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to re-evaluate assumptions. She's a reminder that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties, while kings like Pal have long taken the spotlight. The Red Queen's reemergence reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasures she left behind. It's the conversation she started among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in the temple tells us something deliberate. this woman mattered. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of her story. Not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now stares back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not voiceless, mysterious, but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence, and still, somehow, she speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July the 6th, 1907, in the vibrant district of Coyoacan, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was filled with color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of four daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilde Calderon, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites. Guillermo, reserved and intellectual; Matilde, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and bold. She read voraciously and asked questions most adults didn't want to answer. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. A physical difference she tried to mask with long skirts, but one she refused to let limit her spirit. The illness left her bedridden for months, isolated from other children. During this time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally sharp. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't aspire to become a wife or a homemaker. Her goal was to become a doctor. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at age 15, one of only a handful of girls accepted. There, she stood out, not just for her intelligence, but for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and unique sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as the Cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged tradition. But even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body and the fame that would define her legacy. Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too big to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacan, she was preparing to remake herself entirely. On September 17th, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend Alejandro Gomez Arias after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and probably arguing. Frida never did anything halfway, but moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future unraveled into pain, metal, and silence. The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her right leg shattered. Her foot dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen was pierced. She was just 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent numerous surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, immobile, writhing with infection and uncertainty. The future she'd imagined of becoming a doctor slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a special easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. First out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity, it was survival. The crash had broken her physically, but it had also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time, as Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, a body fighting itself with every breath. She began to paint. What started as a form of therapy soon became a language, and that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often hard to look at, which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain, her pain, physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, I paint myself because I am often alone and because I am the subject I know best. Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas, her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding. In one painting, she is impaled by nails, like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape, tethered to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated, and bare, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was not sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story, she was inventing a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, albeit painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain, she made the world look at it. And in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, already Mexico's most famous painter. Massive in both stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it, but now she wanted his opinion of her work. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his scaffolded work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and said, "Yes," and not just out of kindness. He recognized in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain and beauty. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creative. Frida once said, "I suffered two accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an odd pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter, but he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Christina. Frida was devastated, and in return, she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939. Then she remarried a year later under different terms. This time, Frida would keep her autonomy, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and the heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her, he wounded her, but he also believed in her as an artist, a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could be. Together, they were not peaceful, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, leaving her with deep political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself for vanity. She painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape, with her body constantly in pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit. She turned inward. Her portraits showed her bleeding fragmented and exposed. Yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss, a fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional, a canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tijuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all intertwined in her work. While Rivera painted murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost, the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not just a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, a force, an artist whose work radiated with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully into herself. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacan became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a blend of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. Here, she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tijuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi on the street outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more political. Works like the two Fridas revealed a divided self, one in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to label her as one of their own, she pushed back. They thought I was a surrealist, she said, but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality. She painted Mexico, not the romantic postcard version, but the living, breathing country she adored. Her work pulsed with symbolism: skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while unmasking the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued to decline. Multiple surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became daily realities. Still, she painted through it, propped up in bed, torso bound in corsets, fingers clenched around the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico, not to rest, but to reclaim her power through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of the self. As the 1940s wore on, Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling succession. At times, she was bedridden for months, encased in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. But still, she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a release and an act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant. She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In the broken column, she presents herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face is stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain, for Frida, was no longer just a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also grew louder. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and called out imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared at protests in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile that doctors told her she couldn't attend. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed, dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her own work. She greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and harrowing. In Marxism will give health to the sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits, they were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13th, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place she had been born, the Casa Azul in Coyoacan. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted by pain, surgeries, and the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was brief but piercing. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even as his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She was a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, unibrow, gaze, flowers in her hair, became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text, and her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow, but in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings, she left behind a mirror and dared us all to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere, printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct gaze, all instantly recognizable. But what makes her legacy powerful isn't just that people know her face. It's that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida didn't try to be flawless. She didn't fit into boxes. She wasn't conventional, and she didn't care to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us realness, raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her different: her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that transcended borders and decades. She's become more than an artist. She's a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't require permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she's a daughter reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like the two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column aren't just seen, they're felt deeply by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction, a communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable. And through it all, she painted, not just with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, she told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now, when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance, we see Frida, not gone, but immortal.